Estamos grabando la clase del día 1 de julio del grupo 2 de la UMCE, Grammar One. Debo dar el agradecimiento público a un estudiante, no me recuerdo del nombre, Kilaman creo que era el apellido del ayudante, creo que fue él. Y si no, perdón al increíble ayudante de hace muchos años atrás que nos ayudó a hacer o que hizo esto y que el profesor Pichihueche me compartió. Este es un muy buen resumen, muy buen resumen de todo lo que hemos hablado durante las últimas dos clases y les pido por favor que estén muy atentos y cualquier duda me avisan. Verb phrases. Well, a verb phrase is a syntactic structure built around a main verb or head. I would say a verb phrase is a syntactic structure built around a main verb or lexical verb, any of those. The idea of head comes from the idea of phrase, right? So I would say that a verb phrase is much more related to the verb head, that is to say, the lexical verb. The verb phrase is the central element of a clause, right? A clause is a group of phrases, and a clause is built around a verb phrase. Why is a verb phrase so important? Well, it is so important because it is the verb phrase, the one which will provide the idea of valency pattern, which is the pattern that clauses in English language they follow, right? So the idea of subject, verb, object, complement, and adverbial comes at this point. A verb phrase is formed by the presence of a main verb and auxiliary verbs, and sometimes an adverb. Inside of verb phrases, you have verbs, always verbs, but sometimes and quite often you can have the presence of a thing called intrusive element. That intrusive element is an adverb. I have always something. I have always played, for example. But in interrogatives, the intrusive element might be, for example, a subject, right? Will I play, right? So I is interrupting the presence of the verb phrase. Examples of verb phrases is there you have a lexical verb, can't drive. There you have the presence of a modal verb, a negative particle not, and the main verb, the verb head drive, has never been taken. In that place, you have the presence of a modal verb. Well, a primary verb has the adverb premodifier never, the auxiliary verb been, and the main verb, lexical verb head taken. To be loved is also another verb phrase. The difference is that in this verb phrase, it is non-finite because the auxiliary verb doesn't have anything or doesn't have any mark for tense. The same with playing. Playing, you just have the ing form, right? Has been works in the same way, can be seriously taken. And finally, the longest English verb phrase will have been being examined, where you have all the different elements that can vary inside of a verb phrase, right? Um, so in the last example, will have been being examined to have the presence of a modal verb will. You have the presence of the perfective aspect have been, the verb have plus the ed2. Then you have the presence of a progressive aspect with the verb to be and the verb in ing. And finally, you have the presence of a passive voice with the verb be and the main verb in ed2, right? And that's the longest verb phrase ever. Types of verbs. English verbs can be classified at least into three different forms or into three different categories: the idea of modal verb, primary verb, and full verb. I would add another one, a fourth one, the idea of semi-modal, but they are inside of modal verbs, right? A modal verb, they express modality, which means pragmatic meaning. They are always used as modifiers. And in the previous lessons, we have seen in the PDF file that they share certain characteristics. For example, they can be inflected, they precede the subject in a yes/no question, they take a bare infinitive as a main verb, and so on and so forth. Right, so that you must review that previous PDF file. For example, and there you have the huge list of them. I have to say that inside of this list, there are they are written in pairs. Some people say that modal verbs can be represented or they can state references to present and past. Therefore, you can have pairs, like, for example, can, could, where can is the present and could is the past. I won't say so, even though I accept that idea, but I prefer the idea of degree. There is a degree of certainty around modal verbs, so you can actually organize them or categorize them in a continuum with some modal verbs which they represent or they state a lower degree of certainty and or a weaker degree of certainty, and some other ones which might state a stronger degree of the same term, right? So with that idea in mind, for example, the modal verb might is absolutely less certain than the modal verb must, right? Might, must. So they are the two, perhaps the two ends of of that continuum, right? In this very same example, we have verbs ending in to, like for example, ought to, have to, need to, used to, right? And they are called semi-modal verbs because they share a couple of the different, I would say, characteristics, right? Like for example, taking a bare infinitive as a main verb, but on the contrary, semi-modal verbs they can be inflected, right? So semi-modals are a mixture between a lexical verb and a modal verb, right? Then we have primary verbs. Primary verbs are verbs which can be or they can perform the role of auxiliary verbs and main verbs, right? Um, and there are three of them: do, be, and have. The verb do, also called the dummy operator, the operator is the first auxiliary verb, right? The verb do is being used when we need to create questions in present simple or when we need to create negatives, right? Why? Well, because present simple and past simple they don't have auxiliary verbs. There's no periphrastic construction around them, right? So as we need the auxiliary verb, then we put the verb do or did, right? The verb be is also a primary verb, and you can find them in the progressive aspect, right? So the example, she is sending. You can see the verb be in its third person singular form, the S form, right? Therefore, inflected by the bound morpheme Z2, and then being followed by the ing form or present participle of the main verb, um, in order to create the progressive aspect, right? In this case, as the first auxiliary is in its present tense, we call it present progressive. But if we might find this with the verb be in its past tense, we will call it past progressive, and so on and so forth. The other way in which we can find the verb be as an auxiliary verb, I would say, is when we're dealing with passive voices, right? Where you have the verb be followed by the ed2 form or the ed2 bound morpheme inflection, right? Let's remember that the ed form ed2, it's also called past participle. Finally, the verb have, right? The verb have is also considered to be a primary verb because we're going to use it so as to create the idea of perfective aspect, right? And it works in the very same manner as the verb be. Therefore, if the verb have is in its, for example, Z2 form or S form, then we will say it's a present perfect, right? But if we can find it in its past form, I would say ed1, I would say, then it is called past perfect, right? Voy muy rápido, chiquillo, voy bien, me avisan. Esto es un resumen nomás en todo caso. Types of verbs. full verbs, also known as lexical verbs. Okay, that's a best way in which we can call them lexical verbs, right? They can be classified as regular or irregular. Regular if they follow the rules that when you inflect them with an one ed1 bound morpheme, we are just going to add ed at the very end of them. On the other hand, if they don't follow that rule, they are considered to be irregular, right? They are used as main verbs, right? But also primary verbs, as we already saw, right? And then we have examples of it, like I like trains, I do karate, I do not do any exercise, right? Um, Nothing new, I would say. Forms. Let's remember that English verbs, they can be written in four different manners: the base form, number one; the S form, number two; the ing form, number three; and the ed form, number four, right? The base form is used so as to represent the idea of present tense, right? Present tense. So I hear a riot coming close. I can see that the verb phrase is here, and that the verb head here is written in its base form because there's no inflection in it. The base form is also used in order to represent the idea of non-finiteness, and in this case with two different forms, the to infinitive and the bare infinitive, right? The S form is when we inflect a main verb or a lexical verb with a bound morpheme Z2. Therefore, you have these S form verbs, and they are used to represent the third person singular, right? So the example is he hears some noise, nothing new. The ing form, the third form, is being used so as to represent the progressive aspect and also in order to represent non-finite verb phrases. So, for example, in the first example, he is hearing a joke. Hearing is in its ing form because it is in its progressive aspect, right? In the second example, hearing closely is important. There you have a non-finite clause. Why? Because it is written around a non-finite verb phrase. That non-finite verb phrase is represented by the presence of an ing form, right? But that ing form is the present participle. So be very careful with that idea, right? When you're talking about non-finite, then you're saying present participle ing and past participle ed. But if you're talking about finite forms, you are most certainly talking about progressive aspect. Finally, the ed form, that is to say, the ed form it could be both, right? Ed1 or ed2. They are used in tensed verb phrases in order to represent past tense, perfective aspect, and passive voice. Meanwhile, the non-finite forms are used in order to represent non-finite verb phrases. They are called ed clauses. Okay, so in the example, she heard the news yesterday. Heard is a verb phrase made out of a verb head heard, and that verb head is in its ed form because it is in past simple. And the second, has she heard the news yet? Okay, that's a verb phrase, has heard, and that verb phrase is the main verb. Heard is written in its ed2 form because it is a past participle, because it is in its perfective aspect. The third example, news are heard by some people. The verb phrase is are heard, and the verb head heard is written in its ed2 form because of the passive voice. And finally, having heard the news, I left. Having heard is a verb phrase, and that verb phrase is the verb, this last verb, the main verb is heard. It is written in a ed2 form, therefore past participle, therefore or because it is in a perfective aspect. Any question? Okay. Finiteness. Okay, let's remember before this, let's remember the idea of tense. Tense is the grammatical representation of time. And when on once you are able to represent time in a verb phrase, then we call those verb phrases finite verb phrases. If you can't do that, then they are called non-finite verb phrases, right? So finite when the first verb or only verb show tense, past or present, or is a modal verb. Be very careful. Verb phrases can show tense by three different means. The very first of them is whether they are in past, the second, whether they are in present, or the third, whether they have a modal verb. So, for example, might be understood is a verb phrase with a modal verb, therefore finite. Is having the same idea, and where's the tense? The tense is in its first auxiliary verb, is. Believe, it can be an S form or a pair form or a base form, right? But they are used in order to represent present simple or past simple, therefore they have tense, and all the rest is the same idea. Non-finite when the first verb or only verb does not show tense, right? In the cases of true infinitives or verbals, verb phrases, starting with ing forms. So, for example, having been planning is a verb phrase, but a non-finite verb phrase. Why? Because there's no presence of Z2 or ED1 or modal verb, right? To write is the same idea, being examined and to bleed. Let's be very careful with this, and please remember that. Remember the following idea. As modal verbs are also a form in which we can represent the idea of tense, therefore finiteness, in non-finite verb phrases you can't have modal verbs. Then, la estamos haciendo súper corta, qué bueno. Types of verb phrases. Verb phrases, as well as lexemes, if you remember them, they can be written in different forms. Therefore, they can be classified into four different types: simple verb phrases, complex verb phrases, compound verb phrases, and discontinuous verb phrases. A simple verb phrase is a verb phrase which has just one single verb, right? So I play the drums. Play is one single verb, therefore that's a simple verb phrase. Complex verb phrases are created once you have auxiliary verbs. It doesn't matter the amount of them. Okay, but we already know that you just can have four different auxiliary verbs, right? So for example, I will be playing the drums. Will be playing is the verb phrase, and it's considered to be complex because there are two different auxiliary verbs. Compound auxiliary verbs is once you have two or more verb heads. How can you have that? You can have them if they are linked or joined by the presence of a coordinating structure, right? By a coordinator, a fanboy, right? The word and, or, but, for, yet, so, nor, right? Like in the example, I play and sing at the same time. That's a compound verb phrase because there are two verb heads and they are linked by the presence of the coordinating conjunction and. Finally, as I already told you, um, the fourth different construction type would be the discontinuous verb phrase. And this is a verb phrase in which you can find an intrusive element. These intrusive elements are adverbs or subjects in questions. So, for example, in the example, I have almost played the drums, the verb phrase have almost played is a discontinuous verb phrase. Why? Because there's an intrusive element, that is to say, the adverb premodifier. And in the second one, where have I played the drums, the verb phrase have I played is a discontinuous verb phrase because there's this subject in the middle of it. Any question so far? No? Okay.
I have one.
Yeah.
In the compound example,
Mhm.
what do we have to do with the verb head?
You just have to write them down as verb heads. Let me help you with one example. So let's take this as an example, and we're going to provide an analysis for this. First of all, this is a verb phrase performing the role of the verbal part of the clause, where I have one verb head, one coordinating conjunction, and one verb head, and that's it. So in a compound verb phrase, you can have more than one verb head, and they must be linked by the presence of a coordinating conjunction. And coordinating conjunctions are the ones we call fanboys, and apparently you should know them perhaps, because they are the coordinators for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. But usually you will find and, but, or, and probably nor. Is it clear?
Yeah, thank you. I
Okay.
didn't know you could have two verb heads.
Yeah. Be careful because you can also find them with auxiliary verbs. Even though you have an auxiliary verb, what you will have is anyway compound, a compound verb phrase, and you just repeat the same analysis, and it's the same. Any other question? No. Okay. I'll move on. Importante, llegamos al momento del análisis de una verb phrase. Construction types of complex and discontinuous verb phrases. Okay, the present we are going to provide an analysis for a verb phrase, and that analysis is well, it contains different characteristics or different points of information. The very first stuff I have to say is that the variations in the verb phrase, they receive letters, right? So once a verb phrase contains or shows modality, you're going to say, or we're going to add the letter A. Therefore, if I say I will play, I will say that the construction type is letter A. Why? Because there is modality. Then, if the verb phrase is showing perfective aspect, then we're going to say its construction type is letter B because B goes for perfective aspect. Letter C for progressive aspect, and letter D for passive voice. Okay, let's take this into another example. Okay, finite verb phrases, they can be written in different manners, but not in any manner. Therefore, there is a pattern. This pattern has to do with the presence of these letters: A, modality; B, perfective aspect; C, progressive aspect; and D, passive voice. So, a verb phrase, an English verb phrase, can be written in different ways, right? But they are not at random. They follow these patterns. These are the patterns that these verb phrases are following. And as you can see, it is always moving forward. That is to say, you have letter A, B, A, C, A, D, but never B, A, or never D, B, right? It's always forward. So, for example, the verb phrase may have examined is a verb phrase, and the construction type is A, B. A because there's a modal verb may, and B because there's a perfective aspect in the presence of the auxiliary verb have followed by a main verb in ed2. And the same happens with the rest, right? Any question?
¿Y eso se tiene que aplicar al análisis?
Sí, lo vamos a ver al tiro. Quedan, creo que 3 diapositivas y después los ejercicios.
Vale.
No es necesario, quiero decirlo abiertamente, no es necesario que se lo aprenda de memoria. Lo que tiene que hacer es ser capaz de reconocerlo. ¿Sí? Cuando pongo la letra B y C, D y eso, ¿ya? Anote al tiro, al ladito de esto en una hojita, pero que se acuerde que existe un patrón más, el doble A, ¿ya? El doble A, patrón doble A, es cuando hay un modal seguido de un semimodal y después el main verb. Como por ejemplo, want to, will want to go. Or might have to go. Patrón doble A, modal más semimodal. Then, non-finite verb phrases, they can be also written following these patterns, but they are fewer, right? So once you have infinitives or participles, right? And these are the patterns. To have examined or having examined. Lo repito nuevamente, no necesito o no es necesario que se lo aprenda de memoria, solo debe ser capaz de reconocer la progresión. Let's see the way in which we must analyze a verb phrase. And this is what you need to add to your syntactic analysis. Order of analysis. The very first stuff you're going to need is knowing the type of verb phrase, whether it's simple, complex, compound, or discontinuous. Then you need to add the letters, the construction type, the letter or the combination of letters. Then you need to add the finiteness. It can be finite or it can be non-finite. Finally, you're going to add all the possible information about the main verb, right? So in the example, might be understood. We will do the following analysis. Might be understood is a complex verb phrase. Why? Because there are two different auxiliary verbs, might and be, right? Slash. The construction type is AD. A because of the presence of the modal verb might, and D because of the presence of a passive voice, right? The passive voice is produced by the presence of the verb be plus a verb in ed2. Then we're going to state that it's finite because of the presence of the modal verb, right? And then we're going to add the information about the last verb, that is to say, the main verb. Understood is in its ed form. That form is called past participle. And it's written in that form because it is in passive voice. ¿Queda claro? Ok.
Profe,
Dígame.
podría ser como, o no sé si lo va a hacer al final de la clase, pero como un ejemplo, así como todo lo que tiene que tener la prueba,
Sí.
como un ejemplo.
Sí, sí, no hay problema. Tranqui, tranqui. Imaginémonos que en la prueba tenemos esta verb phrase y yo les pido el análisis de la verb phrase, ¿sí? Les pido entonces, porfa, en un minuto intente hacer todo lo que pueda de lo que acabamos de ver. Un minuto, muy cortito, la vamos a hacer al tiro y luego les voy a mandar ejercicios para poder hacerlo. Solo quiero que vayamos viendo si podemos hacerlo o no. Inténtelo, no es necesario que quede bueno. Recordemos cuáles son. Is hardly justified. Eso es lo que dice ahí. Is hardly justified. Perdón por mi letra también. Is hardly justified. Ahí está lo que debería colocar. Is hardly justified. Un minuto y revisamos, si es muy cortito, solo para ver si puedo hacerlo. Ya, revisémoslo. Is hardly justified. Is hardly justified. Okay, so the very first stuff we're going to do is stating whether it is simple, complex, compound, or discontinuous. As there's this adverb premodifier, I would say this is discontinuous. Slash. Now I need the letters. Okay, I can see there's a passive voice, right? Because of this verb is the verb be, and it's followed by the ed2 form of another verb, of the main verb, right? So this is letter D, right? Then I finite or non-finite. As there's the first auxiliary verb, right, is written in present, I can say this is finite. Now, I will add all the information I can from the main verb, right? The main verb is written in its ed form. This ed form is called past participle in some places, right? But they called it past participle. And because there's a passive voice. The last thing I'm going to add is the base form of the main verb, which is justify. And that's it. ¿Alguna duda?
¿Y por qué está en past participle?
Porque tiene la ed2 form. Una ed2 form aparecía en las clases de la semana pasada. Un verbo puede ser de dos grandes tipos. Puede ser finite y non-finite. Si es non-finite, puede ser to infinitive o participle, ¿cierto? Los infinitives son to infinitive y bare infinitive, y participle son dos. Son present participle, los que se escriben con ing, y past participle, los que se escriben con ed. En este caso, como tiene un ed2, no tiene tense, y por lo tanto, como se escribe con ed, es un past participle.
Vale, entonces esa última parte considera solamente el verbo, ¿cierto? Que
Todo lo
me
que está
había
en
confundido un poco.
paréntesis, todo lo que está en paréntesis es solo del main verb.
Eso, main verb.
Ujú.
Vale, profe.
¿Ok? ¿Alguien más? ¿Otra pregunta? ¿No? Maravilloso. Son unos capos. Ya, les voy a mandar entonces ahora un set de Estamos trabajando para usted. Ese set de verb phrases y necesito todos los análisis de ella que lo escriba y lo revisamos después. ¿Ya? Se lo mando de inmediato al correo. Denme un segundo. Estamos trabajando para usted. Un segundo.
Profe, entonces en la prueba, la parte de desarrollo o análisis, ¿se tendría que hacer de esa manera o incluir eh, cosas de la materia pasada?
O sea, la parte de la próxima prueba, la parte de análisis, es un análisis sintáctico que incluye el análisis de verb phrases. Y la parte de teoría es sobre las variaciones de las verb phrases. ¿Sí? Por ahora quiero que hoy día trabajemos la idea de verb phrase, que veamos esto y que quede bien claro. Y mañana les voy a enviar otro set de oraciones que ya tienen que hacer análisis sintáctico, más las oraciones de las verb phrases. Perdón, el análisis de las verb phrases. Distinguidos, como pueden ver, ya tienen en su poder el set de verb phrases que necesito que hagan los análisis. Así que son las 16, son las 17 horas. Juntémonos a las 17:30. Creo que es suficiente, muchísimo rato. 17:30 y revisamos lo que hizo. No se salga de la reunión, yo voy a apagar la cámara, el micrófono y voy a dejar de compartirla. Voy a seguir compartiendo la pantalla con el PPT en la parte de cómo se hacía el análisis. ¿Ya? Eso. 17:30 nos volvemos a juntar y revisamos todo, ¿vale? Estamos grabando. 17:30, entonces. La primera ya la habíamos hecho, is hardly justified. Y is hardly justified. Let's change colors so we can actually. Okay, so this was discontinuous. Discontinuous. Then it has a passive voice, right? So letter D. Then it is finite. And now the main verb. The main verb is in its ed form because it is written ed form, therefore past participle, right? Therefore past participle. And finally, because of the passive voice. And the verb infinitive form, the base form is justify. Right, so we already did this. Let's take a look at the second one. Let me do something. There we go. Would have heard is complex. Complex. Pesado. Complex, and then I can see the presence of a modal verb and have heard. That's the present of perfective aspect. As there's a modal verb, this is finite. And now the main verb. The main verb is in ed2. Therefore, it is it's in a in a needy form, right? Therefore, past participle because of the perfective aspect. Finally, the base form is here. ¿Algún problema con la segunda? ¿Queda
Esa
claro?
como última parte donde dice perfective aspect,
Ujú.
ahí no tenía claro en todo el ejercicio si es que tenía que poner como passive o active voice.
Ya,
O,
mi primera pregunta es, ¿usted es capaz de reconocer un perfecto, un progresivo y una voz pasiva o no? Esa es la primera pregunta. Yo creo que sí, ¿cierto? Presente perfecto, presente progresivo. Esa es la primera pregunta.
¿sí?
Sí, ya, perfecto. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cómo lo reconoces? ¿Lo reconoces porque el verbo está en ing o porque está el verbo to be más un verbo en ing? A lo que voy con esta es la siguiente idea. En la segunda y en la primera, hablemos de la primera. La primera es una voz pasiva, pero ¿cómo la reconozco? ¿Cómo sé que es una voz pasiva? Yo sé que es una voz pasiva porque está el verbo to be, lo voy a rayar ya, con verde. Ahí está el verbo to be y ahí está el verbo en ed2, ¿cierto? Entonces la voz pasiva es esta unión, ¿ya? Por eso tiene letra D. Veamos la segunda. En la segunda es un poquito más difícil porque tiene tres verbos, ¿no? Pero este es un verbo auxiliar, o sea, un verbo auxiliar y es un modal verb. Por eso tiene letra A. Y luego, have heard es un perfecto, ¿no? Un perfective aspect. Pero ¿cómo sé eso? Porque aquí está el verbo have y este verbo que lo sigue es un lexical verb en ed2. Entonces, esa es la unión de estos dos, donde está el perfective aspect. Lo que les quiero contar es que la forma de un verbo depende o la impone el verbo anterior. Have, en el segundo ejemplo, se escribe have y no having y no had ni has, debido a que adelante de él hay un verbo modal. Por lo tanto, la única forma que puede seguir después del verbo modal es un bare infinitive. Y luego, have, sin importar su forma, impone la forma del verbo que sigue. Solo puede, si está have y otro verbo más, el siguiente verbo tiene que ir en ed2. No hay otra forma. No sé si comprenden esa idea. ¿Se entiende?
O sea, no es lo que me refería a la pregunta, es que, o sea, todo lo tenía bien en el ejercicio, excepto como la última parte. Dice perfective aspect, me había confundido, sí, passive voice.
Ya, es que es por lo mismo que te digo, pues, ¿cachai? La passive voice se hace con el verbo to be y un verbo, el main verb en ed2 y el perfective aspect es verbo have y un verbo en ed2. Veamos el que sigue, mira, aquí va a quedar más claro. Must have been expecting es complex, ¿cierto? Porque tiene complex. ¿Qué forma tiene? Tiene un modal. Have been, ahí está un perfecto. Been expecting, ahí hay un progresivo. Y eso es todo lo que tiene. ¿Queda claro por qué pongo ABC o no?
Sí, profe.
Ya, perfecto. Ahora vamos con finite o non-finite. Como tiene un modal es finite. Y ahora vamos con el main verb. El main verb es expecting. ¿Qué forma tiene? ING form. ¿Cómo se llama esa forma ING? Se llama present participle. ¿Y por qué está en present participle? Porque tiene un perfective aspect. No, un progressive aspect. ¿Cuál es la forma base del verbo expecting? Expect. Ay, suelta mi computador. Ahí sí. Expect. ¿Queda claro? ¿Dudas, consultas, problemas, preguntas?
Entonces la última parte, de cierta manera, respondería por qué es de esa manera el verbo. Por así
El
decirlo.
main verb, ¿cierto?
El
Todo
main
lo que
verb.
está en paréntesis es sobre el main verb.
Vale.
Sí, ok. Hoped. Hoped es diferente, solo un verbo, entonces es simple. Muy bien. ¿Qué letra tiene? No tiene ninguna letra. Rayita. Estamos todos claros por qué le pongo la rayita, ¿cierto? Porque no tiene ninguna letra. Porque no tiene modal, no es perfecto, no es progresivo y no está en voz pasiva. Hoped, vamos a creer que es un pasado simple, entonces es finite. ¿Qué forma tiene? Ed form. ¿Y por qué tiene esa ed form? Porque está en past simple. ¿Cuál es la forma base? Hope. Queda claro. Ya. ¿Problema en esa? ¿En la segunda, en la cuarta? ¿No? Ya. Dare to tell. Dare to tell complex. Se va entendiendo ya. Tiene dare to, semimodal. Ah. Dare como semimodal es finite. El main verb tell está en su bare infinitive, o sea, su base form, porque está en bare infinitive. ¿Y por qué está en eso? Porque tiene modality. ¿Cuál es la forma base? Tell. ¿Se entiende? Espere que
Profe,
siga.
Sería...
Dígame, de uno, de uno, de uno. Dígame
No,
algo.
dale,
profe,
Karen.
yo tengo una duda que yo sé que lo explicó antes, pero yo me perdí. ¿Por qué no podría ser discontinuo esta?
Porque dare to es un semimodal y ese to es parte del verbo dare,
Ah, ya, profe, gracias.
como want to, have to, need to, be going to. Eso, otra pregunta.
Eh, disculpa. There to sería el semimodal.
Exacto.
Ah, no, gracias.
Ok. ¿Se acuerdan que hay una combinación de letras que no aparece en el PowerPoint, que es la doble A? Un modal y un semimodal y después el main verb. Para que tengan cuidado. Recuérdenlo. Live or die, or coordinating conjunction, entonces compound. ¿Tiene modality? No. Does it have perfective or progressive aspect? No. And passive voice? No. So nothing. Let's imagine that's a present simple thing, right? So therefore it's finite. And now both verbs they have the same form. Therefore they are in their base form because they are in present simple. And the base forms are live, die. And that's it. ¿Preguntas? Okay. Likes. Only one verb, therefore simple. There's no modality, no perfective, no progressive, no passive, therefore nothing. Clearly, clearly is finite. It is clearly finite. Crap. Now it is on its S form, right? S form because it's in its present simple, right? And the base form is like. Okay, buying, the same idea, also simple. There's no modality. ¿Alguien le puso letra C a esto? No es letra C, no es nada. ¿Por qué no es letra C? Porque no tiene verbo to be. El progressive o perfective aspect o passive voice requieren de la presencia de ambos verbos. En este caso solo está buying, así que solo non-finite. It's on its ing form, is a present participle, and that's it, nothing more. Its base form is buy.
¿Podría repetir por qué es non-finite?
Es non-finite porque no tiene una inflexión ni un modal que nos marque tiempo. ¿Cómo sabemos eso? ¿O por qué sé eso? Porque en inglés solo marcamos tiempo de tres formas: por la presencia del Z2, ED1 o un modal. La única forma posible, la cuarta forma, sería una base form ocupada en presente simple. ¿Ya? Esa es la teoría. Voy a bajar un poquito de la teoría. Buying no está asociado a ningún tiempo, piénsalo así también. Todos los finite son asociados a tiempos, o sea, a presente simple, presente progresivo, pasado progresivo, presente perfecto, pasado perfecto, futuro con will, ¿cachai? Todas esas formas son las finite. Buying no cabe en ninguna de ellas. Voy a volver a la teoría. Para que buying tenga la letra C, requiere de la presencia del verbo to be. Verde. Eso es progresivo. Me refiero a que aquí está el progresivo, ¿cierto? Aquí está el progresivo. No sé si te das cuenta que el verbo to be puede estar en diferentes formas. Que en will be buying es progresivo y have been buying también es progresivo. Lo que te decía hace un rato era que la presencia de un verbo influye en cómo se escribe el que sigue, ¿cachai? Por lo tanto, lo que nos interesa buscar es que cuando hay progressive aspect, perfective aspect o passive voice, es que estén los dos verbos juntos, como por ejemplo en la última, donde dice to have been loved, to have been loved, que claramente es complex. Pero ¿qué letras tiene? ¿Alguien la hizo?
BD.
Tiene un B, ¿cierto? De progressive, de perfective. ¿Dónde está? En have been, ¿no? Y después tiene una D, muy bien. ¿Dónde está esa? En been loved. Esta es non-finite, sí. El main verb es loved. Está en su ed form porque es un past participle debido a la passive voice. Y su base form es love. Y ahí está hecho todo. ¿Alguna duda, chiquillos, chiquillas, compañeros? ¿Ninguna duda? Perfecto. Ya, entonces, lo que voy a hacer yo ahora es renderear, que pase el render del video, subo el video, les mando un correo con los materiales para mañana, nos juntamos mañana, ustedes hacen ejercicios y los revisamos. ¿Queda claro? ¿Alguna duda, consulta, problema?
Profe, una pregunta.
Dígame.
En la parte del paréntesis, donde ya se empieza a hablar lo del verbo, no hay como un patrón que se sigue, por ejemplo, primero form, después esto, después
Sí,
esto otro.
es forma, ¿cierto? La forma. Después, ¿por qué tiene esa forma? Y el efecto que provoca esa forma. Si te das cuenta, sigue un patrón. Siempre colocamos cuál es la forma. Así comenzamos. ed form, ing form, ed form, base form, base form, s form, ing form. Después colocamos cómo se llama. ed form, past participle. ed form, past participle. ing, present participle. ed form, past simple. ¿Cachai que ahí cambia? Y después colocamos por qué ocurre eso. Eso ocurre, ese past participle ocurre en la primera porque hay una passive voice, en la segunda por un perfective aspect, en la tercera por un progressive aspect. En los simples ocurre simplemente porque está en present simple y past simple, nada más. La quinta también es importante, modality, porque hay un modal, por eso se escribe con bare infinitive, con bare infinitive. Base form, bare infinitive. ¿Queda claro?
Sí, ahí sí. Muchas gracias.
Ok. Ya,
Profe,
chiquillo, dígame, perdón.
disculpe, en la prueba, ¿usted va a poner puros verb phrases o tenemos que contextualizarlo
Mira,
en
lo que
una
te voy a
clase?
contar en un ratito más va a ser esto. Esto es lo que vamos a hacer mañana. Los ejercicios de la prueba en dificultad es del número 7 al 18 y dejé del 1 al 6 ultra difíciles para los más valientes. ¿Ya? Pero lo que tienes que hacer entonces es hacer el análisis sintáctico de la oración completa más agregar el análisis de las verb phrases. Eso es la parte de análisis. Y esto es lo que te tengo que mandar en un ratito más. Y lo hacemos mañana en clase. Consulta. ¿Creen que será necesario? Les ofrezco correr la prueba para el viernes 9 o la quieren hacer el jueves 8. Si la corremos al viernes 9, tenemos una clase más con dudas para el jueves 8. ¿O les da igual?
Por mi parte, yo diría que sí, porque el 8 nos corrieron una prueba de fonética, por lo menos a mí.
Ya.
Corrieron una prueba de fonética. Entonces, igual, sí.
Corrámosla para el 9. ¿Qué opina el resto de la gente este momento en el que hablan?
Por mi parte está bien el 9.
Ya. ¿Dos sí?
Lo
O
pruebo.
por-
Sí, yo también digo que sí.
Ya. Ya, entonces la corremos para el 9, oficial. Nos juntamos el jueves, o sea, mañana nos tiramos a hacer esos análisis, todos los que alcancemos, y rematamos el próximo jueves para tener la prueba el viernes, ¿vale? Ok. Ya, chiquillos, que tengan una linda tarde. Nos vemos mañana. Les mando el correo apenas pueda subir el video. Chaito.
Gracias,
Chao,
Gracias,
profe.
profe.
Chao.